Hi, I'm Matt Needham, and this is my lecture on refrigeration based on the Uniform Mechanical Code, Chapter 11. And when we talk about refrigeration, we're talking about taking heat from a place where we don't want it and intensifying it and dumping it to a place where it's unobjectionable. That's the definition of refrigeration. And this chapter is concerned not just with refrigeration, but because the code is kind of based on older concepts, air conditioning or cooling occupiable spaces is also part of this lecture on refrigeration. And we're going to be focusing on the traditional refrigeration cycle, not absorption refrigeration, because this cycle is what really cools 98% of everything that's in society. Whether it's your window unit or domestic refrigerator or a centrifugal chiller or a walk-in freezer or an ice maker or whatever you can really think of, it's cooled with the refrigeration system. And then what is a refrigerant? But it's a fluid that circulates around the refrigeration system and that is turning from a liquid to a vapor in the evaporator as it absorbs heat, as refrigerant comes in the evaporator. You have a low pressure, low temperature liquid with a little bit of vapor. And as this fluid flows through this coil, you can think of it like a radiator coil, it cools whatever we're trying to cool down. Now, think of this as a window unit, and the air might come in at like 75 degrees or something like that. And this coil absorbs that heat from the 75-degree air. And since the air gave up its heat to the colder refrigerant, the air comes out at you much colder, let's say 55 degrees. Okay? And this evaporator then absorbs that heat and boils off or evaporates the refrigerant into a low pressure, low temperature vapor. The compressor sucks this vapor from the suction line, gives it an honorable discharge out the discharge line. Because you're taking these molecules and squeezing them to a smaller pipe, the temperature and the pressure go up. So we're picking up the heat here, we're intensifying it, and then as it goes to the condenser, which you could think of the back end of your window unit, the part that sticks outside, perhaps you felt warm air coming out of that, we're dumping the heat where it's unobjectionable, right? Where we don't care about that we're dumping a little heat outside. And as the refrigerant flows through here, it gives off its heat and it condenses into a liquid, flows down the smallest of the three lines. The liquid line goes to our metering device, which in this case is a thermostatic expansion valve, and is metered down, or it drops the pressure. When it drops the pressure, a little bit of that liquid refrigerant turns itself into vapor and the whole compound gets cold, and you have a low pressure, low temperature liquid refrigerant with a little bit of vapor that goes around. So this fluid, and fluid means can either be in a vapor or gas state, flows around the system. And we need regulations, and the code is mainly about the amount of refrigerant you can be exposed to, not having a big quantity of refrigerant that can fill a space, displace oxygen, cause suffocation, saying, okay, we're going to allow little units to be like, it's okay, your refrigerator in a kitchen only has whatever 10 ounces of refrigerant in it, or your window unit, that's okay, but we can't have a tremendous amount of refrigerant in a place that could leak out, and then we could have, health problems because of it. All right, so that's a little bit of an introduction just on the refrigeration cycle and on refrigerants, and we'll get more involved in that. Now, the classification of refrigeration systems, the code classifies in two types. Refrigeration systems shall be classified according to the degree of probability that a leak of refrigerant will enter the occupied space. So we have high probability systems and low probability systems. High probability systems means that it can likely get into space, but then they have some exceptions, like how much parts per million does the volume of the space contain if you had refrigerant released. And generally speaking, it talks about around 6.6 pounds. Small equipment like window units, domestic refrigerators, things like that, They can be in the occupiable space because they usually just hold a number of ounces of refrigerant. So they, even though they're kind of high probability systems that you could get some refrigerant in there, that's okay according to the code. Then low probability systems are where we actually put our big equipment that holds a lot of refrigerant, because those aren't in occupiable spaces. So if something holds a tremendous amount of refrigerant, you don't want it to be where people are, because then a giant leak could cause environmental situation, cause people to suffocate and like that. So that concept of high probability and low probability, and we have different regulations for chiller rooms than we do your bedroom at home, okay? And then the concentration of refrigerant shouldn't exceed certain parts per million. Let's talk about the safety classifications first, though, about refrigerants, so we kind of understand a little bit. Refrigerants, here we have this chart that talks about the safety. And going up this way, we have increasing flammability. And this is A1, which would mean non-toxic and not flammable. And then as we go up, this would be a little bit, A2L is a little bit flammable but not toxic, more flammable, but not toxic. Okay, then here, B1 is saying it's toxic, somewhat toxic here. And then this one, B3, would be toxic and flammable. So they always try and keep it at A1 if they can, and we'll talk about that. And then the parts per million for different refrigerants, and I'll talk about that here on this chart now for a little bit. We have different refrigerants, and these refrigerants that I've listed probably cool 90% of everything. There's other refrigerants, but these are the most popular, or generally speaking. R22 is an A1 classification, not flammable and not toxic. And it has an OEL, or occupational safety limit, which most of the A1s have, of 1,000. Means you could have 1,000 parts per million of R22 in a space, up to that, continually, every moment for 8 hours, and you'd be okay. They have an IDLH also, which is immediate danger to life and health, which is a much higher number. Like, I don't know, well, I'd have to look it up, but around 5,000 or more, like that, where if you have a room full of a much higher concentration of these refrigerants, they want you to kind of get out of the room and ventilate the area. But these are like, you could be exposed to this amount normally just all for 8 hours continually, and your health would be okay, you know? So 1,000 parts per million for R22, okay? And then R123 we use for centrifugal chillers, and it's a B1 classification, and that they consider it to be somewhat toxic or not good for you. Actually, if you look at the IDLH for that, it's actually not bad just to breathe some of it for whatever, 20 minutes or whatever. But if you're exposed to it for more than 8 hours or more on a continual basis, you can develop health problems. And what they do is they actually take, when they get a new refrigerant, they take it and they make like mice and rats live in these environments, and then they study them. And what they found out was with this, that if they continually had these mice or rats live in the R123 environment, that the male mice would develop benign testicular tumors, the big huevos. So because of that, that's the reason why they're calling it like a little unsafe for people. It's not flammable, and that's why you're getting the 50, the low number, like you shouldn't have a lot of it for more than this for 8 hours, okay? So that's R123. And then R134A is A1, so is 404A, and these are at 1,000. And then R717 is ammonia. Now, ammonia is about the oldest refrigerant. It's the best refrigerant for heat transfer. No new refrigerant, even though we figured out ammonia 130 years ago or more, ammonia is the best one for heat transfer. And it doesn't have any ozone depletion, and it has no global warming, but you get a whiff of it, it can really get you. and it has a low IDLH, much lower than this, and a much lower one over an 8-hour period. I was exposed once by somebody who opened a cylinder in front of me. It did irritate my throat and nose quite a bit for a few days, just getting a couple of, like 2 or 3 whiffs of it. Okay, so that's why we tend not to use ammonia. It's actually great for the environment, but not great for you. Okay, but in some old industrial application stuff, they still will find a way to use it, especially if it can be like not around people. Okay, and then we have R1234YF, which they're putting in cars now. Actually, I have it in my car, and it's an A2L. It's just very slightly flammable. Some concern in my car, but it's not toxic, and it's 500 parts, but it still gives you the OEL of this. And I was thinking about that, like maybe they're saying just because it's somewhat flammable, a tiny bit, that we want to have less of it in an environment, so they probably put it at 500 instead of 1,000 for that reason. Okay, and we'll get involved in the global warming potential after a little bit. Okay, let's get back to the actual code. Here on ventilated spaces, it says here, where a refrigerating system or a part thereof is located with an air handler in an air distribution duct system or an occupied space served by a mechanical ventilation system, the entire air distribution system shall be analyzed to determine the worst case distribution of a refrigerant leak. So the basic concept, and my teaching style is really just understanding concept. You're not gonna, we tend to have these chillers they make chilled water, where you have the giant chiller with 1,000 or more pounds of refrigerant in, not an occupied space, but a machine room. And then we chill water, and then we pump that water through coils, kind of like this, and blow air over it to cool. And a lot of times we might have 50 or more of these chilled water coils serving certain areas, right? And a lot of different areas have different temperature requirements and whatnot, so we control that zone individually. And we don't want to use refrigerant for something like that for 2 reasons. If you have a leak, obviously refrigerant costs a lot more than water. And also, think of one of those 50 coils, like if you had 1,000 pounds of refrigerant and that evaporator leaked out into the ductwork, and then where do those ducts go? You could, fill up a big space over time, like and displace oxygen. So this kind of concept is why we also tend to use chilled water systems to keep the possibility away of a tremendous amount of refrigerant getting into the occupied space. Okay. If you have a chiller room, it's got to be isolated so that refrigerant can't leak out of it into an occupied space. We're going to talk about recovered refrigerants here. It says here, recovered refrigerants shall not be reused except in the system from which they were removed or as provided. You can use recovered refrigerants also for the same customer. They generally want you to take it out and put it back in the same system. If it's corrupted, they don't want you to do that. What do we mean by corrupted? Usually it means an electrical failure with a compressor that has caused acid in that system. Recycled refrigerant means that you're going to take it out and put it through a recycler, which is like what you see in automotive repair shop. They have a little R2-D2 that they wheel out, and it pushes it through a couple of filter dryers. I used to have a recycler that I used, and I pushed my recovered refrigerant through there. It was kind of neat. Through a couple of filter dryers, and then the oil would come out the bottom, any oil that was in the refrigerant, and then any tiny bits of air could be discharged off the top of it, so that the refrigerant you did quite a bit to clean it up. And then we have reclaimed refrigerant, where you take it back to a parts house where it can be brought back to a new standard. And they'll take care of that for you. Now, here it talks about a compressor or condensing unit must be mounted at least 3 inches off the ground. And also, just a point, evaporative coolers also. and that if there's a big rainstorm and these sit outside, you know, you don't want water to get into the equipment, so it has to be on a pad a few inches up off the ground. Okay, 3 actually. Okay. And let's move on. It says here under quantity in 1105.12.1, the amount of refrigerant stored in a machinery room in containers not provided with relief valves and piping in accordance shall be not to exceed 330 pounds. Okay. There's some buildings and some companies, particularly like grocery stores, supermarkets, that will store up to 11 of these. So this is a refrigerant cylinder, refrigerants in here, and the new ones a lot of times this size come 30 pounds, some of them are 25, a little bit smaller. They're generally color coded up till now. Going forward in 2021 and forward, I think they're going to be gray, and they might, I've seen pictures of new ones here in October of 2020 when I'm making this, where the color is the same on the handle and the top, but then this is gray. They've changed it. AHRI has decided to change it due to color differences from manufacturers and what does green mean, and then the fact that the colors change with time and sun damage and whatnot. I love the colored refrigerants. But you can store like up to 11 of these in an equipment room without a relief valve. And there's a lot of supermarkets, particularly like with this one, R22, which is now being phased out. You can't buy a new jug of this anymore here at the end of 2020. But there'll still be, for a number of years, a lot of equipment that has R22 in it because it was so dominant. It's the only one that could do it all. Air conditioning, high temperature refrigeration, 45 to 60 degrees, some medium temperature refrigeration in the 38-degree range, fresh food products. Some low temperature freezers used R22. And a lot of smart grocery stores would used to stock 10 or 11 of the new ones somewhere in a safe location out of an occupied space. And then if any one of their 3 types of major systems, because each grocery store has a major central medium temperature system with like 20 or 30 cases or more, 20 or 30 frozen food cases on its separate system, and then the air conditioning system for the store. And if they had an emergency or a big leak, they would store this amount at the location so a technician could just show up and have it there to work with, which was pretty smart, I think. So that's the maximum that you can store of refrigerants, okay? All right. Refrigerant vapor alarms. So when you do have a chiller room, in like one of these low probability things, people like me have to go into them. And if there was an earthquake or a leak or whatever, they have a lot of safety things now that they didn't used to have when I first started in the trade. There's a lot of new codes and laws where you have to have a loud alarm that makes you want to get out of there before, and these strobe lights. And if you're exposed, I have been to the loud alarms and the strobe lights, you know, you want to get out of there before I kill myself more than suffocate because it's so annoying. That's what they're trying to do, is drive you out of that room. And then at the same time, they'll also ventilate the room. They have a separate exhaust system that will suck air through the machine room and be drawing everything from that and dumping it outside to ventilate that so that when I show up, I can make the repair or whatever and it doesn't leak into other rooms under doors or something, okay? So we have to have that. And then combustion air. Again, combustion air is what the heating appliance needs. The air around it, the air that you have to mix with, let's say, natural gas for complete combustion. It says no open flames that use combustion air from machinery rooms shall be installed where refrigerant is used. I used to work in a big machinery room, had a centrifugal chiller, but then we had to have an isolated room. Within that room, we had air filters from the outside and then air filters individually for each hot water boiler. And the reason for that is this, that most all refrigerants, like these and these, aren't toxic. But generally, almost any refrigerant, if you burn it, it now becomes toxic for people. So they don't want the chance that you're going to have a refrigerant leak and have the refrigerant get to the flame anyway for a heating appliance and then be burning that refrigerant and creating toxic gas. Okay. Okay. Let's move on. Okay. Here it talks about more than 6.6 pounds of refrigerant. You need to have stop valves, suction service valve, discharge service valve, and on the outlet of the, if you have a refrigerant receiver, which would go right here, a separate vessel, not part of the receiver, not part of the condenser, a separate vessel on the outlet of it, that's known as the king valve. Okay. Now, if you have a separate receiver also here, not part of like a water-cooled condenser, which could be a flooded condenser, but if you have a separate receiver, and this system holds more than 100 pounds of refrigerant, not only do you need a king valve on the outlet, you need a valve on the inlet, which is known as the queen valve. Okay. Okay. And then pressure relief devices are for this reason, that, you know, on these larger systems, like chillers and whatnot that hold tremendous amounts of refrigerant, we have pressure. And the first time I saw this, I'm like, what's this copper pipe? Where does it go? It comes off the top of the condenser. It's going outside. It's open. What is that? Well, that's a pressure relief valve. And I was like, I don't get it. We're not supposed to vent refrigerant, but it's the lesser of two evils. We do vent refrigerant because, like I said, when you burn refrigerant, it becomes toxic. So you have a chiller that might hold 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 pounds of refrigerant. That's a lot of refrigerant. Now, if that building catches on fire and you have a roaring fire in that building and the temperature, maybe the actual chiller isn't on fire, but maybe it gets to 400 or 500 degrees because the fire's all around it. Inside your refrigeration system, the pressure temperature chart is still valid. Now, when you look at a pressure temperature chart online or a card or something, you'll see that as the pressure goes up, as the temperature goes up, the boiling pressure goes up, or as the boiling pressure goes up, we could say the temperature goes up. So what we're saying is that most of them stop around 150 or 160 on the charts that you look at. Okay, and you'll see that, oh, okay, you know, we can, sometimes for an R22 system, you could see that it gets to 360 PSI, but you never get that on a system, but the PT chart goes up to that, okay? But if you have a roaring fire for R22 or something, or any refrigerant, and it gets up to 500 degrees, the PT chart doesn't stop at 160 just because your chart stops. The pressure goes up and up into the thousands of pounds, and we're going to find out in a minute that these systems aren't designed to handle that. And so something's going to crack or leak. So if you had a chiller or something with a lot of refrigerant that in a fire cracked or leaked, now you hit that fire and it shoots out the refrigerant with the refrigerant hits the flame, and now you have a giant ball of toxic gas, and here come the firefighters, a lot of dead firefighters and people in the neighborhood. So before that happens, we'll actually vent all that refrigerant out the roof, outside. So that's the idea. Why we have a pressure relief valve on chillers is for that reason. Okay? All right. Let's move on. Now, when we pressure check a system, we generally use dry nitrogen. If we don't have any refrigerant in the system, we'll leak check it, we'll put pressure in there, and also with dry nitrogen, you can do a standing pressure test where maybe you fill up a system with 150 psig of nitrogen, just vapor, right? And you leave it overnight, and then you come back and see, you know, is it now 145 or 140? Did some of it leak out? Do we have a leak? And if it doesn't, it's still 150, you're starting to feel pretty confident you have a very tight system, okay? We purge with dry nitrogen, we leak check with dry nitrogen, and you're also allowed to add 5% of actually the refrigerant that's in the system now to leak checks, because we have these electronic leak detectors that sniff a sample of the air around the equipment, around the refrigeration system. And in order for them to pick up and go off because it goes beep, 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 beep. When it hits a leak, you need to have a sample of that refrigerant in there with the nitrogen. It's just a tiny little bit, and it will mix with the nitrogen, and then as it leaks out, it would help you find the leak. So they'll allow that, and then actually we do tend to just vent out the nitrogen with a minuscule amount of refrigerant in it when we're done. Okay. Also, we have here different refrigerant numbers and their field test pressures. Now, I want to explain to you that one of the things, I think there should be a lot more with nameplates. It should be bigger, and it should tell you the tonnage right on there, 5 tons or 100 tons. It should be very plain, not hidden in the model number. I kind of wish that. But one of the things that they have on nameplates is the test pressure. And a lot of times people get deceived by that. They're like, R22, the test pressure on the low side is 230, and for air cooled on the high side would be 360. They're saying that when they made it brand new, they've guaranteed that it handled those pressures, and don't ever exceed those pressures out in the field if you do a pressure test. Okay? 134A is 250 on the high side, 150 on the low side. So when you see these pressures, it has nothing to do with the operating pressures or the standing pressure when the system's off. It just has to do with what they guaranteed it could handle when it was new, and the recommendation for you not to exceed these pressures if you do a pressure test on it, like with dry nitrogen. Now, a lot of systems, if you just remember 150 and you put that in for most systems out there, that's okay. And a lot of times I'll look more at the low side test pressure, because once you put dry nitrogen, it tends to go to the whole thing. So if you're just focused on the high side one, you know, that's a much higher number, which the low side may not be able to handle. But, you know, in reality, if you go a little bit above that, you know, normally it's not going to have any unsafe condition, but just use that as a guide. We're not really supposed to exceed those test pressures, okay? Now, let's take a look here again at this chart for a minute with the different refrigerants. And first, let me just say this about the refrigerants. Again, we just phased out. They stopped making R22 systems in 2010. They stopped selling them in 2011. But everybody who bought a new system in 2010-11 wanted to be able to have it maintained, right? So they allowed the sale of these jugs of refrigerant, R22, up until this year. And now you can't buy it anymore, brand new from a parts house or anything like that. And the reason that we've gotten rid of it was because it did contribute somewhat to ozone depletion, okay? And that's why it was phased out, because we had decided a long time ago in the 90s, we got to get rid of R11, R12, and R22, and so now we have. But you'll still find R22 systems out there here and there, slowly going away over like the next 10 to 15 years. Now, all of these, and now we're looking at these refrigerants here, and we're saying, well, wait a minute, now in the last 15 years or so, we're not just concerned with ozone depletion. Because when we became concerned with ozone depletion, that's when the companies came out with, started selling 134A in the 90s, 410A, and then 404A. Because none of these contribute to ozone depletion. But now we're looking at the refrigerants and we're like, wait a minute, global warming is such an issue, we need to deal with that now as a planet, right? And so now they're looking at the global warming potential of these refrigerants, and they base these numbers on carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, which is the 800-pound gorilla in the global warming story, and I have other videos where I explain global warming in more detail. They use that as a standard, right? Carbon dioxide is 1, and then how many times worse per same amount of refrigerant compared to carbon dioxide is it? Now, there's billions of times more carbon dioxide, or trillions of times more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there is all these refrigerants combined. But when you release these, they cause global warming quite a bit for the amount that you release. So how much? Which is the worst ones? The higher number is the worst one. So R22 is 1800, but we're getting rid of that also because not only does it have global warming potential, but some ozone depletion. I hate to say goodbye to R22, but which is the refrigerant of my life. R123 has a very low global warming potential, but we are probably looking for better refrigerants also because of the B here, and that it's a little bit toxic if you're exposed to it for long periods of time. R134A is 1400 global warming potential, but then R404A, I mean, I think we kind of need to prioritize, like, all right, let's just get rid of 404A, like, we can do that because it's not as common, it's not as used, it's not as popular or as much equipment as 134A is, or 410A. 410A is used for air conditioning. This is freezers. This is medium temperature refrigeration, car air conditioners, older cars, and some chillers. This is all packaged air conditioning systems. This is split systems, ductless mini splits, window units, 90-ton air-cooled package units, etc. 410A, right? And then R717 doesn't have a global warming potential, but it's pretty toxic, okay? And now we have newer refrigerants, these hydrofluoroolefins. And out of all of these, this is the newest refrigerant. This would be R1234YF. And I actually have this in my car now. My car is about 2 years old. And this is what I have in my car. Very minimally, a little tiny bit, poquito flammable, but still a little bit, not toxic. And it only has a global warming, no ozone depletion, only a global warming potential of 4. Okay? Also, you'll notice that refrigerants boil at atmospheric pressure at low temperatures. Again, water is R718. Water at atmospheric pressure, if you're sitting at the beach, boils at 212, right? The lower the temperature that you'll see a lot of these, like R22 boils at negative 41 degrees. R123 is 82.2 degrees. And it operates because of that at a very low pressure. R134A is negative 15, really negative 15.7. 404A negative 51. So these are, like, literally I talk about if you walked into a real walk-in freezer that was minus 20 with a bucket of liquid R134A, and you went in there like, damn, it's cold, it's negative 20, and I have this bucket, this liquid bucket, I'm going to set it down and leave, and then you go outside the freezer, shut the freezer off. As the heat leaks into the freezer, once that temperature rises from negative 20 to negative 15, that refrigerant's going to boil off into that freezer. So that's a good example of what we're talking about, okay? And also, in conclusion, again, these refrigerants have these colors to them. So R22 is a green cylinder, okay? 134A is light blue, and then 404A is orange. It makes it easy to identify. Kind of a dark gray is R123, and 410A is rose or pink. And I think you might be seeing in 2021 where they're going again with these gray cylinders, which is like big print, like 134A across the whole side. And the ones that I've just seen on the internet have like the old colors just on the very top of the cylinder. And that concludes my lecture on refrigeration.